the second virtual meeting of the International Trade Committee as we look at the trade in agri-foods, part of an inquiry into the effects of COVID-19. I'm glad that we're joined today by two panels of two guests, and we'll have the first panel of our first guests, our first experts joining us, and ask them both to introduce themselves, starting with Fiona.
Good afternoon. I'm Professor Fiona Smith, and I'm Professor of International Economic Law at the University of Leeds.
Thank you very much, and thank you for making the time to join us today. I hope you don't have to travel too far. It's one of the benefits of this new world.
Yeah, not too far, not too far.
Very good. And their second guest, please.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Committee. It's Bob Doherty here, and I'm Professor of AgriFood, N8 Chair in AgriFood at the University of York, and also Professor in Marketing in the York Management School. I'm also Sustainable Food Theme Leader in the York Environmental Sustainability Institute, and I run a large research programme called I Know Food, which is funded by the Global Food Security Programme in UKRI. In addition, I'm also trustee on the board of the Fair Trade Foundation.
Very good, thank you. And I suppose in the interest of openness and clarity and declaration of interest, I should say I keep some sheep myself, not enough to make much money out of. And when I speak to New Zealanders and I say I've got 30 sheep and they tell me they've got 26,000 sheep, it makes me, it puts things into some sort of perspective. I should say at this moment, we should be being joined also as a guest to the committee today by Neil Parish MP, who's the chair of the, just as I utter the words, I think I'm seeing some semblance of possibility that Neil Parish, chair of the EFRA committee, is joining us, which is a welcome addition to our committee this afternoon. But to kick off first to Professor Doherty, can I just ask for a scene-setting question? How would you characterise the UK agri-food sector?
Well, first of all, it's very important to the economy. It's worth £113 billion. It's the largest manufacturing sector. It employs nearly 4 million people, so it's very, very important. It's highly integrated internationally. We import around 47% of our food. 30% of our food actually comes from the European Union. 10 to 15% of those imports come from developing economies. Our grocery sector is highly concentrated. So if you take supermarket retail, nearly 70% of that market is represented by 4 major retailers. And their system is very just in time. So it's very lean, because of advances in technology and logistics over the past 15 to 20 years. What you find is those supply chains are very quick. For example, a retailer can create its own order from its electronic point of sale data, place that order before 12 noon today, and that could be for leafy salads or vegetables from southern Spain. That order will go straight to the pickers and packers, and it will be delivered the next day at some point. They call it day one for day two. So it very much relies on a frictionless trade system. The other kind of key component of our food sector is obviously the out-of-home sector, which has obviously been severely affected by COVID-19. And I think the other part of our food system as well is our exports. And 60% of our exports go to the European Union, which I think is also very important. And I think what COVID-19 has done is actually showed our food sector as a system. And I think that's very important. The activities from farm and fishing to the consumer, the outcomes in terms of food security, and also the socio-economic and the environmental interactions with those activities. And COVID-19 has been a great example of how we need to look at our agri-food sector through a food systems lens.
I mean, in the past, I'd heard that, I think you alluded to there, but it's the ordering of stuff on day one. It goes on a lorry in Spain and can be in the shelves in the south of England at the very least within 12 hours of being picked. I think peaches was an example I was given. Are there any more examples of just that rapidity of movement that maybe we don't all appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, it's very speedy. I mean, I think it relies on obviously free movement of goods across borders. It relies on advanced logistics and transport and technology. It relies on a kind of roll-on, roll-off ferry facility. So the Dover Strait, the Dover-Calais maritime strait is very, very important. And even if you look at our ordering of tropical fruits from West Africa, say from Ghana, pre-packed mango, pre-packed pineapple, that's also day one for day three. So that can be ordered on a Monday and delivered on a Wednesday into regional depots of major supermarkets in the United Kingdom. So these supply chains rely really on advanced, transport capacity, free movement of goods, frictionless trade, and that's the way. And I think in terms of the current pandemic, paradoxically, it's exposed the vulnerabilities of that system because it's very lean. It relies on that speed, that frictionless movement, and I think. It initially, particularly when we had panic buying and stockpiling, it really did expose that particular system that is seen as an advancement in a way.
I think what we've learned from last week was having parallel supply chains or having resilience in place. And I think something else you're maybe hinting at there today, and I'm almost reluctant to mention the word Brexit and potentially the problems that Brexit might have given. There'd been another interruption coming the way. But before I go down that avenue, I just wanted to check the stuff that you have coming from West Africa from day 1 to day 3. Does that go via Europe or come direct air freight into the United Kingdom?
It comes. If you take one example, British Airways from Accra straight into Heathrow. That's how that system works.
So that there's not the potential the disruption of a Brexit. And the free movement that other foods might be that are coming from Spain or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's important to also point out if you take things like vegetables, 32% of our vegetables come from the European Union, and mainly from Spain. In terms of our food imports, that 30% that I mentioned, it's really key 5 trading partners: Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. But by produce type, if you take vegetables and leafy salads, 32% is coming in from southern Spain.
Yeah.
So that's obviously very important. And I think grocery trade and those retail supermarkets, that's very important for their income. If you walk into a supermarket, the first thing you see is an array of vegetables and fruits, and it's very important for their business model.
Thank you, and I'm tempted to go down and inquire a lot more about this because I find it a fascinating subject. But I better move over to Neil Parish, who I think is going to take up with the next question, next points. Neil, his microphone is muted. Can we get there? There we go. I think we have him, Mr. Parish. No, he's gone again. His microphone's muted. We need to unmute his microphone. Yeah.
Right. Okay now.
Yep.
Hello.
Hello, welcome.
Okay, Angus.
Welcome to the welcome to the International Trade Committee. This is obviously an upgrade from EFRA, I'm tempted to say, but I won't go down that avenue at all.
Very much appreciate, Angus, you inviting me. And my question really follows on from yours in a way, is that how vulnerable is the UK agri-food supply chain to the impact of COVID-19? I mean, what are the strengths of the chain and which are the most likely to have disruption in the future if it carries on for a very long time?
That question is for me. Thanks, Mr. Parish. I think the single market stood up pretty well. If you look at the supply of ambient goods and fresh produce, it stood up reasonably well. Obviously, in the initial stages of the pandemic, you had panic buying and stockpiling, and because of those just-in-time supply chains that I've just explained, obviously you had a number of different out-of-stock situations. That also created a problem for those people who in the United Kingdom who are food insecure. So I think a large number of food banks, independent food banks particularly, rely on donations within supermarkets. and also they will take their financial donations and go into the supermarket and buy their produce. They might buy 80 bags of pasta or 80 tins of tin tomatoes, and they couldn't do that because of that panic buying and the stockpiling. And I think the volume restrictions that the retailers introduced at a later stage were good, but they should have done that earlier. It would have been a better decision. And I think if we get a second wave, that would be a lesson to learn from the initial situation. Where I'm more concerned is about the produce, the 10 to 15% of our food that comes from developing economies, because we are seeing some significant impacts in the movement of goods in developing economies. We're also seeing produce standing at ports because of labour shortages. You've got travel restrictions, and there are some hotspots. There are some potential problems down the line of, poverty, loss of livelihoods. We're already seeing a lot of smallholder farmers lose their markets and workers being made redundant, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. You've got problems with rice in Asia. So the rice price is increasing at the moment significantly. I think we're at the record price at the moment, the highest price we've had for 7 years, because a lot of that rice is stuck at Indian ports. And so I'm quite concerned about, the impact of labour shortages, the restrictions on movement of goods, of that produce at this moment in time, not only from a UK perspective, but also from a smallholder farmer perspective in those hotspots, northern India for tea, sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa for citrus fruits, so on and so forth. So I think there's a single market stood up pretty well, but I'm really concerned about some of the situations in some of the developing economies.
Can we pull in Professor Smith at this point?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your question, Mr. Parrish. I just wanted to add to what Bob said, and thinking about the supply chain as from farm through to fork. And I think there's a couple of additional things I wanted to add in terms of the impact on the sort of consumer end, if you like. What we've seen, because the disruption to the market, the food market, was overnight, so the government closed some retail outlets like restaurants, getting that food from the supply chain from the restaurants back into the main supply chain to supply, say, supermarkets isn't as easy as it looks. And in actual fact, some farmers' supply chain is directed straight into restaurant chains like McDonald's. So that because of the, as Bob said about the just-in-time supply network, these contracts are not as easy to shift overnight. So we have seen problems of diverting food out of the restaurant sector to the supermarkets and the consumer. That has been problematic. Certainly, I know Leeds City Council has been involved in trying to sort that, and I think that's the case with regional councils as well. And the other point I just wanted to add is at the farm end, certainly we've also seen disruption in terms of inputs into the farm in terms of animal feed. So I think that obviously that has a knock-on effect further down the line, but I think it's something that's important to point out now. Couple of other points fitting on to what Bob said in terms of developing nations. We're seeing ports being closed. So in terms of getting the food from these developing countries to the UK, it has to be taken to a particular port to ship it out, which slows the food coming out down. And obviously we've had difficulties in terms of countries closing borders. So some of the supply routes, the traditional supply routes, are becoming a lot more challenging. So countries like New Zealand, Australia, they're stopping flights coming out. So just to add those extra points. Thank you.
Okay. Angus, could I come back on a couple of things?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Just on the carcass balancing on the beef animal, there is a lot of mince being used, but we're not eating as many steaks and good joints because we're not going out to the restaurants so much. So I think we need to promote the British food more there. And then a supplementary on when we're buying in the supermarket, should we?
Has Neil frozen? Have we lost Neil there? Neil, are you? Sorry, Neil, I think you froze there. Am I right there? Did Neil freeze? Yeah, I'm seeing Matt. Thank you, Matt, for that. Neil, can you repeat your question?
Conscious that, right in short tonight, maybe like more potato, and perhaps we are able to buy more potatoes and less rice, or more pasta if the pasta is in better supply. I just wonder whether we've got international responsibilities as well.
Who wants to take that, Professor Smith or Professor Doherty?
Yeah, I think we've seen, I can take that if you like. I think we've seen a real change in consumer habits because everybody's in lockdown. So apparently, according to Kantar World Panel figures, 503 million meals are eaten more in the home per week than they were before lockdown. So you're seeing an increase in certain things like bacon, ready-made meals, but you are also, as Fiona rightly said, because of the loss of the out-of-home sector, you are seeing impacts on the dairy industry, where 80% of that milk was supplied into cheese, and milk was supplied into the out-of-home sector, and so you are seeing a kind of change. And I think what you do see with some of the livestock farmers, some of the British beef farmers, they are finding markets direct to consumer. So we have had some really good examples of resilience where farmers and growers are going straight to direct to consumer with a higher quality product, bypassing the retailer at a local level. So we have seen a relocalizing of food supply, which I think is one of the positives to come out of the pandemic, I would say.
Thank you.
Professor Smith, you want to add anything?
Just that I think we need to think about our legal responsibilities and our moral responsibilities to countries obviously outside the UK. There is a human right to food. It's not something that I've written about in my own work because I'm a trade specialist, but certainly that is something we need to think about. Individuals' right to food in other countries, and certainly just in terms of some of the legal rules, which I think you want to get onto later, there's management of the UK's response to sort of problems in our supply chains. We have to balance our response against our legal responsibility to other members of the World Trade Organization and to other trading partners.
Thank you. That's another point, that a human right to food as well as just the economic right or the financial right, or the fact you can buy the food. I think in Belgium at the moment, actually, it's almost patriotic to have 2 portions of chips a week. They've got a glut of potatoes. Moving to my favourite part of Wales at the moment, the Middle East of Wales, and Craig Williams. I think you're going to come in next. Thanks, Craig.
It's equally patriotic to eat Welsh lamb here, of course. Building on Professor Smith, what you were saying about the impact of supply chains, whether I can dig into Montgomeryshire is one of the biggest rural agricultural constituencies in the country, and of course we've got premium products which we export and finding a new market for them. But equally, our beef and dairy have been impacted by the kind of supply problems you've seen in McDonald's, etc. Can I ask you for particular evidence or the impact that opening up with Professor Smith of what this has done to our exporters of food, as well as, of course, our domestic problems?
I don't have any direct evidence I can give you on that. I can talk about the legal restrictions, but perhaps this might be something directed to Professor Doherty, because I know he's worked directly on the impact on the food sector.
Yeah, we can jump over. Professor Doherty?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think exports to the single market have actually held up reasonably well. I think the government and other governments have really focused very well on keeping goods moving. And I think that's, if you look at lamb, if you look at, milk as well, and cheese, those exports have continued. I guess where there is a problem is exporting to places like China and South Africa, where those ports are closed. There is a problem in pre-contracting, so people, because of the uncertainty in the international markets, people are not pre-contracting at the moment, which is leading to more uncertainty and fluctuations in the prices. So there is some price volatility. And I think further down the line, if you look at things like pork, then at the moment, because of the closure of the out-of-home sector in the US, there has been a lot of stockpiling of pork meat. When that comes onto the market later in the year, when that floods the market later in the year, there is concern around fluctuating prices and a price drop. In certain commodities like rice, we are seeing, because of export restrictions, we are seeing, and that's a problem because that's a staple crop, we are seeing increases in prices of that particular commodity. We need to keep a track on it all the time. There's some very good databases. The Food and Agricultural Organization have a really, really good commodity database that tracks some of these exceptions and prices. And yeah, that's the monitoring and evaluation of that is really, really important.
I suppose, Chair, just a quick follow-up. You touched some of there about the imports into this country, but in terms of our domestic market, where we rely on those exports as well to keep our farmers' businesses alive, what have you seen in terms of that?
Well, I think in terms of your part of the world, where lamb is really important, lamb and mutton exports to France, those have held up. The demand is still pretty strong. So I think that's encouraging. I think one of the problems later down the line is can we keep that going? We wouldn't want, for example, a shock upon a shock. So, for example, a climatic event or a no-deal Brexit, all those things would really add to the uncertainty and the problems in those export markets.
Thank you very much. And I think just a follow up to that, and I think it's related to Welsh lamb, and it is along the interests that I'm personally involved with as well, but I know my constituents are, is when lambs come on in the autumn. I mean, what are we expecting to happen to the price of lamb in the autumn? Is it going to tank? Will the exports be there? Because that certainly affects Wales, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland as well.
Yeah, I think it's too early to. I mean, obviously those are important factors, and it's probably too early to forecast that. I mean, I'm monitoring on a daily basis the AHDB commodity report, which looks at British lamb, British beef, and the exports and British pork, and their main message is kind of potential volatility in those markets. The important to keep a close watch on those, both right across government, really, both from an ITC perspective and also from a DEFRA perspective.
Thank you.
Can I ask one quick one?
Professor Smith, before we go any further.
Just to say, we've got to think about the impact on of the virus on the slaughterhouse workers as well. Just going back to the point about lamb, can we sustain it? Well, it depends if the slaughterhouses remain open. So whether you can actually ship the live animals to the slaughterhouse and then push it through the supply chain. So are there enough workers? And certainly what we're seeing in the US, I think Reuters reported a couple of days ago that pig farmers in the US are having problems not being able to ship their pigs through the slaughterhouses because they're closing due to illness. And as a result, the farmers are either having to slaughter the piglets before they're born to abort the piglets, or alternatively get rid of their dispose of their pigs themselves and just put them to landfill. So that's an issue that is particularly prevalent in the US, and I'm not sure how much it's the case for the UK, but it's an issue down the line, I think.
Thank you for those points. Certainly points I hadn't considered, and I think there's a lot of this that we hadn't considered or wouldn't been aware of. Moving over to Merseyside now, Mick Whitley MP.
Thanks. Yeah, good afternoon, Bob. Good afternoon, Fiona. Could you tell me how stable have UK food supplies from overseas been during the COVID-19 pandemic?
In terms
Go on, Fiona, you go first.
No, do you want to take it, Bob? Because I think this is something that you're working on anyway.
Yeah. Thanks, Mick, for the question. I think the question is about stability of those food supply chains. When I think if you take those imports, which is about 46-47% of our food supply, the ambient goods and the fresh produce coming in from the European Union has stood up reasonably well. I think there's been a lot of focus from governments on keeping those goods flowing. There's obviously been labour shortages and there's been a lowering of productivity in some sectors, but the goods have managed to keep coming. And I think the collaboration, I think another thing that the government did, which was a good move, was to relax competition laws. And it meant that the retailers and suppliers could collaborate all together. So there's been a lot of awareness raising around health and safety with suppliers. There's been a lot of collaboration on sharing supply rather than one retailer secure a large amount of supply against another one. There's been a lot more collaboration there. We've also seen a lot of good practice, and I can go into that later if you want, kind of exemplars of businesses, saying we're going to change our payment terms, we're going to pay smaller suppliers straight away. So it's actually brought out some real positives in the market. What I'm more concerned about is obviously the supply from developing economies, as I've already mentioned, because of problems with the movement of goods, problems with port closures. They don't have the same infrastructures and health systems that we have. So as Fiona's rightly said, there's a kind of moral responsibility and a real need for international collaboration across the G7 and across the G20. Notice that the G20 have suspended all debt repayments to developing economies. I think we've yet to see the real ramifications of COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa and in other parts of the world. A lot of produce is not being harvested because of a lack of labour. If you take tea in northern India, a lot of tea is just not getting harvested because the migrant labour has gone home, and there's a real problem. You will see an increasing cost in the cost of production because people are having to social distance. People are using disinfectant, protective clothing. That's adding to the cost of things like bananas. So we will see price inflation in the market. But actually, the produce from the single market, which is 30% of our imports or 30% of our overall food supply, has stood up. Despite all the challenges, has actually stood up pretty well. Apart from the early stages when we had a lot of stockpiling and panic buying, which exposed the vulnerability of those just-in-time systems, because it is a very lean, speedy system. Retailers are not keeping a lot of stock because of their business model.
Could I just ask a supplementary question, if I may?
I think Fiona, was Fiona wanting in?
It's fine. I can wait till the question's asked if you want, and then come in after that. It's fine.
Apologies, okay. Continue, sorry.
Yeah, the question I was going to ask the supplementary was, why have we seen a lack of certain products on shelves during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think another that's a good question. I think certain goods people have been stockpiling and overbuying and panic buying. If you look at canned goods, there's been a real panic buying of those, which if you keep a very lean just-in-time system, that will create out of stocks, and that's obviously to go back to the stability of our system. It has exposed food security in the United Kingdom because it's meant that the food banking system. The food banking system isn't only the Trussell Trust and Fair Share. It's also a large number of independent food banks who rely on donations from the supermarket, from people when they walk out of the supermarket, putting produce into the basket. Now, if that produce is not in the supermarket, then it reduces the donations. Plus, a lot of those food banks are run by elderly people, and therefore the volunteers for good reasons, have been fearful of continuing their volunteering. So I think it has exposed some of the fragility in our own food system as well, Mick, and we need to be aware of that going forward.
Thanks. Professor Smith.
Yeah, if I sort of come in on that last question and then say the comment, I'd come back to the comment I wanted to make earlier. Just on that point, I think it'd be very interesting. I know it's not the remit of this committee, but perhaps Mr. Parish might want to look into this a little further. Is the shortage on the shelves, on the supermarket shelves? Because what we're seeing in sort of Leeds area with some of my colleagues, anecdotally perhaps rather than scientifically, is that actually there is food available in the smaller retailers, so the smaller shops and also the local markets, which don't seem to have had the food supply problems that maybe the supermarkets have. Now, I don't know whether that's to do with how the UK people shop, or whether it's to do with the just-in-time food system, but I think it's something that's worth mentioning, that our food sector is broader than just the supermarkets in terms of guaranteeing food security. So that's just one point to mention. Just going back to the first issue about resilience of UK supply chains, I think one of the things we now are starting to see is an increase in export restrictions from major commodity exporters, like Kazakhstan is a large grain exporter. They now have restrictions on how much grain they will export globally. We're also seeing stock holding programs, particularly in Asian countries. So the Philippines, Vietnam, are actually increasing the amount of food stocks that they hold to protect their own population. So as a result, they're either restricting rice exports in the case of Vietnam, or alternatively, like Georgia, they're actually buying on the market to increase their own stock hold. So that reduces the amount of rice and grain into our market. So that is going to come into our supply chain at some point. So I think we may have resilience problems going down the line that's outside the control of the UK at the moment.
Just before I move to Mark Hendrick, I mean, is there a philosophical trade question behind the just-in-time philosophy? I mean, just-in-time is something that probably works quite well and is probably a philosophy that came into play to sort of squeeze margins all over the place and maximize profits. But what I'm trying to get at is, you know, just-in-time works when things are going just quite well. But when one thing goes wrong, an Icelandic volcano, a European trade rupture, a pandemic, another natural event, whatever, we might have problems in this. And just a quick comment on that, if we can take that a little bit further, just from the trade point on that.
Yeah, sure. Just so from a trade point of view, sort of trade rules, whether that's World Trade Organization rules or whether that's regional trade agreements that countries have entered into, whether we've got the EU as an example, classic example of regional trade agreements. Those agreements have managed to really reduce the cost of trading cross borders, which has allowed companies to take advantage of cheaper labour, of better growing conditions around the world. So that's increased consumer choice. So we can have strawberries at Christmas if we want to now, or asparagus at other times of the year. So it's increased consumer choice, and it's also brought costs down to the consumer. So these are the things we need to remember on the positive side. The negative side is, of course, the risks of exploitation in certain parts of the world. Bob's already alluded to that, but also the environmental impact of these long supply chains to do with air travel and other issues of that kind, and also resilience, where we have environmental shocks like the volcano that you mentioned or the COVID-19 virus. So there have been suggestions about moving towards self-sufficiency. That's, I know, quite hot on the agenda at the moment. Trade rules, that the WTO rules and maybe regional trade agreements are not going to stop the UK going down that route if that's what they choose to do. Obviously, after they leave the European Union, there'll be a lot more flexibility. But one of the things you have to remember is, although we're enjoying very nice weather now, at the beginning of the year, we had quite severe floods, which I think has affected the potato harvest. Certainly the water quantity in the grain this year is not going to be that good. So we might have to import flour. So it's probably going to be challenging to stay resilient with a completely local food chain, although obviously at times like this there are really positive reasons why you would want to do that before we get into quality of food and safety and those issues which are well known in the Brexit debate.
Thank you. Professor Doherty, you want to come in as well briefly? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good. I've heard this debate around self-sufficiency as well, and I think there's a cautionary note in that if you go back to 1988, which is actually the year that I graduated, we were still even then importing 34% of our food, even at that moment. So we have always been this nation that's traded, to increase consumer choice. There's a lot of products that we can't grow here. Bananas, for example, is Britain's favourite fruit. You can't grow bananas in the United Kingdom. So there's good reasons, as Fiona has mentioned, geographical reasons, price reasons, growing reasons why we have this international system. Now, we probably could grow more of our own produce in the United Kingdom, but there needs to be an evidence base. You could extend the growing season in some crops, but there needs to be a proper strategy to do that. And we certainly couldn't, we certainly still have to be a nation that trades food to supply the produce that is demanded by the consumer.
Thank you. As an avid consumer of bananas, I can only say here to that. Moving on to Mark Hendrick. Mark.
Well, thanks, Angus. That issue follows to my question, really, which is linked. I would really want to talk about export restrictions, and I know Professor Smith has already touched on it. The International Food Policy Research Institute has recently said that at least 15 countries have introduced export bans to date. Fiona's mentioned Kazakhstan, and I've got a list here in front of me. Wheat and rice are typical products. Professor Smith, do you think we're moving towards increased trade protectionism in the area of agri-food? And if so, what impact is it having? And following on from that, if as expected, measures to combat the pandemic are with us for most of the rest of this year, how extensive could export restrictions become? And what legal instruments do you think are there to prevent them? I mean, a lot of the countries involved are not EU countries. Quite a number of them are developing countries. And even while we're in the transition period in the EU, the rules still apply. So there is a differing approach, I would think, depending on which countries are doing it and why. And also this idea of a move towards self-sufficiency really flies in the face of all of that, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think what is interesting to remember is we live in a very global world in terms of the rules that apply to us as much as to where our food comes from. So I think it's always important to remember that we have international trade rules in the World Trade Organization, and that's something that the committee will be very familiar with. But we also have a series of regional agreements that the EU has obviously been, and the UK as a result has been a party to, and there are over 300 of those throughout the world. So there were really quite a complex regulatory space. But I think the one thing that really characterizes all those trade rules is they're primarily about keeping markets open. So they're aimed at the tendency by governments to want to protect their local markets. So in other words, the tendency to put in place import restrictions. So the idea is that you would want to trade, so why would we even bother making rules about export restrictions? Because really the natural tendency, if you like, is to use import restrictions. So as a result, the rules are actually quite limited in the regional trade agreements and also in the WTO rules on export restrictions. So there's a lot of flexibility there. So I can say a little bit about those, and obviously I can go into more detail if the committee would like to hear, but it is possible for WTO members to impose a temporary export ban on the export of critical foodstuffs. So things that are absolutely essential to our diet and our well-being here in the UK, so, and other WTO members, obviously the EU as well. That is possible. It's got to be a critical shortage, so it's a temporary measure. And when this has been interpreted by the WTO court, if you like, they've said temporary is not a specific moment in time, but the idea is it shouldn't go on and on and on and on. You should identify what the problem is, and as soon as the problem's over, you should remove that restriction. You mentioned the IFPRI report. The WTO as well has issued a report just a few days ago on 24th of April, suggesting that although the rules say these measures should be temporary, in actual fact, quite a lot of the measures have not been temporary. And what we're seeing is members either failing to notify the WTO that these measures are in place, which is an obligation, particularly in terms of foodstuff, and just failing to remove them. So it is a concern. Obviously, the UK has been involved in an initiative at the WTO trying to encourage states throughout the world to keep their markets open. So what we've had is, I think we were involved in a statement on the 22nd of April, along with other 24 WTO members, to try and increase the speed of trade, to encourage all members to avoid export restrictions, and to remove export taxes as well, which makes the products more expensive. So it doesn't ban them, but it makes them more expensive to export. Obviously, that's not legally binding. And 24 members were involved in that declaration, but there are 164 members of the WTO, so that's another problem. So I don't know whether we're seeing a tendency towards greater protectionism. I think it's too early to say. Certainly, countries are very wary to go down the export restriction route, because the last time this happened was in the food crisis in 2008. And as a result of significant export restrictions by key exporters like Russia, we saw a lot of price volatility and a big fallout with that. So I don't think we're at that place yet, but we may be seeing early signs.
What about legal instruments?
Yeah, sorry? Legal restrictions. Not in terms of retaliatory. There's nothing we can do in terms of retaliatory terms. We could actually bring a claim to the World Trade Organization. We could actually say that whichever country we're particularly concerned about is not complying with the WTO rules, it's particularly in the GATT. So we could do that. There's a time delay to that. We could raise the issue in a WTO committee. There is an avenue for discussion and possible consultation within the committees. Dependent on whether there was any dispute settlement mechanism within a regional trade agreement, if an export restriction is banned within a regional trade agreement, there is a possibility of going through the regional trade agreement. But again, a lot of it depends on what the rules say as to how we can respond in the regional trade agreement context. So in terms of retaliation, I think it's very limited. So what we'd be better off doing is thinking about, do we want to import more from different sources? Are there new countries we could trade with? If we go down that route, we need to think about the quality and the standards and the environmental impact of those products. Do they meet our usual standards? Or we could think about maybe ramping up domestic production. And obviously we could go down that route. We could have targeted subsidies, but again, that's problematic in WTO rules terms. So it's not the same as if a country was dumping a lot of cheap produce on our markets, in which case there are trade instruments we could use. We're not in that same place.
Thank you. I can see that Mark Garnier and Paul Girvan are both perhaps animated. And Paul, how you doing? You might want in this area, and then Mark. A microphone is muted for Paul. Can we unmute? Yeah, Paul, you're on.
I feel that most of the question has been well answered, but it's in relation to, and I'm looking at it from a Northern Ireland perspective, as we're so heavily reliant upon our agri-food sector and our access to markets other than the UK market for our business. This would have a very negative impact if we were to put on export restrictions or to see export restrictions upon certain food types, because it is all part of one big, what way should I put it? It is all part of the overall market, and we add into that as a part. So by taking measures to impact on one sector, it could affect the whole market. So we do need to ensure that we do not go down the route of looking at export restrictions, because this might cause a knock-on effect to other sectors other than just our agri-food.
Yeah, nervousness in Northern Ireland there from restriction in trade. Sorry, Professor Smith, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I was just going to come back. I think there's a couple of points there. At the moment, obviously the UK has resumed negotiations on the Brexit trade deal with the EU. I think the ambition in that agreement is to have frictionless trade as much as possible. So one of the aspects of frictionless trade is obviously removing export restrictions. So the hope would be that UK-EU trade deal would go a long way to helping keep trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland open. In terms of WTO rules, I hope that this will not be the case, but in terms of WTO rules, because there is significant volumes of trade between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, there is a duty for the UK to consult with the Republic of Ireland should they wish to impose an export restriction. So it's a duty of consultation to a major exporter. In other words, the Republic of Ireland would be a major exporter, and as such, the UK, well, Northern Ireland and the UK would be required to consult with you. But it's a duty of consultation. It's not a duty. It's not a legally binding prohibition.
Can I pull in Mark Garney at this point? And I'm starting to get conscious of time. I mean, I'm really fascinated by the conversation, but time is another scunner. Mr. Garney, your mic. Can we get Mark Garney's microphone off if he's coming in? He's muted. Yep, Mark, you're on.
Thanks, Chairman. Look, Professor Smith, I just wanted to come back on a number of things that you've been talking about, and one of which is this possible move to self-sufficiency, and that is as a result of various export limitations from various countries. If you take an example, for example, the lamb market. So we import a huge amount of lamb from New Zealand, and it is a seasonal thing. Obviously, New Zealand produces way more lamb than it could possibly need. We, in turn, export lamb to the European Union, and the European Union, as we know in the past, have had problems with importing our lamb, with French farmers burning lambs, many years ago, admittedly, but nonetheless, we have that problem. What worries me about some of your answer is that, potentially you end up with a sort of bastardization of the corn laws. So potentially, if you are a country like France, you may create reasons why you can't import British lamb at that time of year, because what you want to do is promote your own domestic market, and thereby by protecting your own market, you can produce more. That, of course, then leads to various other problems and knock-on effects until eventually you go back to a glut of lamb in New Zealand, where they just can't sell it because everybody's trying to protect their markets. And you talk about the sort of the global rules-based system that can come in and help this. You talk about the World Trade Organization that can sort this out. And you also talk about the fact that the rules tend not to look at these export bans, but tend to look at barriers to entry for imports coming into these markets. The problem is you bring all this stuff together and you end up with an immensely complicated potential problem in terms of blockages and gluts and deficits of food here, there, and everywhere in the world. And the thing that bothers me the most about all of this is we're looking for something like the World Trade Organization to try to sort all this out, and yet it's not working very well at the moment. So where do you see the global rules-based system being affected from in terms of trying to resolve this really complicated problem? Because I'm not entirely certain the WTO has got the teeth that perhaps it once had. And do you think we need to really think about how this global rules-based system actually works?
That's very yeah. I'd say that's a very good question, and thank you for that. The first thing is a pragmatic point, which is even without the World Trade Organization, there would still be a complex system of regional trade agreements that crisscross countries with different interests. That would still be a fact. And the reason is because these agreements are politically important as well as important economically. So they're a fact of life. It would be very nice for lawyers if there was less of them, because certainly my life would be a lot easier. But certainly, as a pragmatic point, I think we're stuck with those at the moment. In terms of the WTO function, despite problems with its dispute settlement mechanism, particularly the appeals function, there are significant problems with it, as you rightly say. Its first tier court function, its panel function, is working very well, and certainly the UK and the EU have been involved in legal fixes, so that even without the appeals function, cases can still be heard. So that's working much better than expected. Certainly in terms of the WTO's monitoring function, that's been very efficient. The transparency mechanisms within the WTO have also been very good. So there's an excellent report by the WTO on the level of export restrictions. They've been able to identify the ones that have been notified to them and the ones that haven't, and produce quite a comprehensive report about what the state of trade looks like. And that's a really valuable piece of information. And what I see as a trade lawyer is, yes, we are seeing issues. There are violations of the rules, and there probably always will be for political reasons. But it's holding up a lot better than the sort of pre-1947 arrangements where you do get heavy protectionism, beggar your neighbour type policies, increased tariffs, making it very expensive for everybody. So I think there's a lot of positives.
One of the first points you're making about the trade being a restriction on exports rather than a restriction on imports, which is a different way from the normal.
Do you mean at the moment? So the trade...
I mean, the Kazakhstan situation is a restriction on the exports rather than a restriction on the imports.
I think one of the problems is that the rules-based order that we were talking about was really created post-Second World War for an issue with a large surplus in some countries and needing to rebuild the European market. So it's got a historic hangover. And certainly what we're seeing is just a new reality with the export restrictions as countries react first to a food crisis and then secondly, to bad harvests, and secondly to COVID-19. But what I would say is going forward, we might expect to see more export restrictions as climate change becomes more of a problem. So certain parts of the world are really struggle to grow food. So this may be something that members of the WTO try to resolve.
So before I move to Matt Western, just briefly, we're seeing export restrictions in the examples of Kazakhstan. Are we seeing any import restrictions, as Mark Garney was alluding to, on the sort of protecting your own home market from, say, a whole pile of lamb or whatever, or grain?
No, I mean, one of the interesting things just to note is there are several automatic trigger mechanisms that will kick in. It's the way that countries sort of manage the price fluctuations, of particular crops like maize, and the EU's automatic price mechanism has kicked in relation to maize because the price of maize has dropped because there's so much maize on the market, and as a result the import tariff on maize, so the import tariff into the EU of maize has increased, and that's automatic. So these there are these trigger mechanisms that will happen automatically to increase barriers rather than active protection of the kind that you're describing.
Thank you. Can I move to Matt Western? And I'm aware of time again. Matt.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of you. It's a fascinating discussion we're having so far. You've described variously some of the issues regarding supply chain problems in the agri-food sector. I just wondered if you could tell us how well you think the government has addressed some of those issues, and then secondly, how well you think government has supported either exporters or importers in the current crisis.
I could start. I think the support of small, medium-sized enterprises has been very effective and very important. Also, relaxing the competition laws for the grocery sector, so they can actually collaborate more and talk to suppliers together to solve supply issues, has been really, really important. And I think that's been good. I encourage the continuation of cross-government working with Department for International Trade, DEFRA, and also DFID. I think this select committee is a good example of that. Some of the issues are impacting on all different departments. Food crosses all many different government departments. I'd encourage DFID to continue with their trade for development goals. Really look at some of the vulnerabilities in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And also, I think there's been a lot of good business policy as well from businesses, relaxing payment terms, giving pre-finance to producer groups. Also, some of the certification bodies have been building resilience funds for farmers as well. And you have also seen some of the retailers actually switch suppliers from their normal suppliers to those people who used to supply the out-of-home sector. So they've relaxed some of their supplier agreements to be more flexible. They've changed product specifications quite easily to allow that. So there's been a lot of good practice, and I think also the support of exports and allowing that free movement of goods as well, and really working hard to keep those supply chains open has been really welcome. And the recent intervention in the dairy sector, I think, has also been important as well in collaboration with the National Farmers Union, because some dairy farmers were really struggling, and I think that's been an effective intervention in the market.
Yeah, so just on the trade side, I think the UK is showing real leadership in the area of trade. I mentioned this declaration with 24 other WTO members on the need to keep markets open in response to COVID-19 and the impact, particularly, well, PPE as well, but definitely food. Certainly within G20 as well. So I think we're really seeing the UK having a very good ambition to try and keep markets open. So I think that's a really positive move. One thing I do think is it's very important to remember that we are in a period of transition from our EU membership to independent, to having an independent trade policy. And we are working within a very global world. We do need to be aware of the bigger hinterland, if you like, the ongoing trade discussions or debates and disagreements between President Trump and President Xi, between the US and China. That's ongoing. There are problems with the US agricultural markets in terms they've lost a significant export market with China. So that is, the US are looking for new markets. So that's something that we need to be aware of. We are operating in that space. WTO fragility we've already mentioned. And also our domestic legislation. It's very important, I think, that our domestic regulation in agriculture and food security fits with our trade regulation, and I'm delighted that we were able to answer some of Mr. Parish's questions today as well. That's great, but I think more needs to be done about that link between trade and our domestic policy, particularly in the context of food security.
Thank you. We'll have to zoom on, I think, if that's okay, Mr. Western, to Mr. Menzies on the west side of England somewhere. Mark Menzies.
Lancashire, Angus, Lancashire. Yeah, thanks, Chair. This is really to Professor Smith. What further steps could the UK take to ensure international trade in agri-food continues to flow freely? And if I could just open up sort of just two potential thoughts that I've got. One of them is the physical. So we're seeing international air routes, particularly long haul, reduced to a fraction, and a lot of uncertainty as to what that will look like when it reopens. And the second bit is the legislative. So, be that sort of bilateral discussions UK is having country to country, particularly maybe potentially new markets, or through WTO, or through G20, or through CPTPP. So it's both the physical and the legislative. Yeah.
So just in terms of the physical responses, I think it's a question of keeping the ports open. So keeping as many ports open as possible. So there are many routes into the UK, not only to do with the physical location of those ports, but also to guard against any illness within to get the goods into the country, and also to keep the supply routes open within the country. So thinking about transport, roads, those mechanisms, the infrastructure as well. So keeping that as free flowing as possible is just really important. And you mentioned air routes, obviously that's important too. So in terms of infrastructure, in terms of on the legal side, I think the UK is doing. My sense is that UK is doing really well in terms of leadership at WTO. They could. And they are, but they could be involved even more in reform of some of the rules on exports, which there are very, very few. So the UK could be at the forefront of trying to instigate further reform in this area. I think certainly new markets is very important. Talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership arrangement that could open new markets. Obviously, China is an important market for the fourth quarter with livestock. It's a very important market. So, seeking trade agreements, keeping trade open, I think it would be very important.
Okay, and I think my colleague Mark Garnier is quite keen to come in, but before he does,
he's not. He's not.
Is he not? Okay, that's fine. Just the final point on this is, how can the Department for International Trade best support the agri-food sector as it seeks to recover from the pandemic? And again, this is for Professor Smith.
Gosh, perhaps in terms, my sense would be, I know this is a little bit of an abdication, I might pass it over to Bob because he might have some more constructive suggestions, but just in terms of really making suppliers aware of maybe alternative markets, maybe new markets that are actually open that perhaps suppliers, producers haven't thought about. So giving information to that extent, sort of facilitating contracts. I know a lot of this work is already being done. So certainly information is very important. Trends in trade are very important. This bigger hinterland I've talked about, giving information about that. Yes, but I don't know whether, Bob, you've got any further suggestions on that one. Perhaps you've got some more specific ideas.
Yeah, I think continuing with the good work in international collaboration is really important through the G7 and the G20, looking at some of the challenges that developing economies are facing. So looking at some of being more flexible around contracting, pre-financing, all these mechanisms that are going to keep vulnerable workers and vulnerable farmers in business. I think that's really, really, really important. And one of my main concerns is also about vulnerable workers, is what you do see in these kind of shocks and situations, you get an increase in pressure on production, and that often leads to increases in modern slavery. And I think we have to be very, very cautious of that as well at this moment in time. So working with our partner governments in developing economies, working with big certification bodies like Fair Trade Foundation, working with big suppliers. I mean, there's a real move at the moment. I think 25 chief executives over the past 2 days have said we really want to work together on, keeping these markets open, but also supporting the food security and livelihoods of farmer communities in developing economies.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair.
Colleagues and thanks, colleagues and witnesses. Just to know, we're really going to be up against time, so if we can be aware of that, we've got a second panel to have shortly, and I'll move over to Robert Coates, who will give a great demonstration of exactly what I'm talking about. A tour de force. There you go. Robert's mic needs to be. He's still muted. Can we get Robert's mic on? I apologise, Mr. Coates, but we've got you on. We've got your mic muted. I'm sure you've got.
Here we go. Chair, thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'll be very brief. We've covered a lot of the ground I wanted to already, but particularly I just wanted to ask a couple of things about the increasing calls that we've heard for national self-sufficiency, which really I think we can probably call protectionism by another name. Could you both comment, please, just on firstly what risks there are to this for the UK, and with a corresponding point on how that's likely to affect UK government as it negotiates around the world?
Okay, so I can take this point first. So I talked about self-sufficiency, the challenges of self-sufficiency, just in terms of what you produce. In terms of resilience of supply chain, it's possible to have shorter supply chains. So that is possible. It's also legally possible as well. What I would always say about any policy measure is the UK government is free to take whatever policy direction it wishes in terms of agri-food trade. Where the law kicks in is the implementation of that policy. So it's the way that you choose to implement that policy. So if you choose to go towards shorter supply chains based in the UK by substantially banning significant products coming in from elsewhere, then that's going to be an issue in terms of WTO, and also in terms of how you negotiate trade deals with other countries. There is also the sense as well, when you're looking to trade with other countries, clearly they want to export their products to the UK. So there's got to be something in it for them. So if we're promoting self-sufficiency, maybe we could do that in sectors where we have a comparative advantage. We're better at producing it than others, and then we trade with those products where we can't grow them, as Bob said earlier, and we really focus on those, and we keep the quality of the products that we're importing up to the same standards that we expect our producers to processor to reach here.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big hot topic at the moment, and I think there's a piece of work that needs to be done on it, because I think the evidence needs to be gathered together. I would like, if there was any increase, obviously, in strategy to increase UK production, whether that was in horticulture or agriculture, then it would be sustainable, because I think we do have a problem with soil degradation in the United Kingdom, and we need to be conscious that in a recovery, that needs to be a sustainable recovery, not just a kind of productionist recovery. There probably is potential, more we could produce by extending the growing season, by using polytunnels and things like this, more vertical indoor farming in urban environments. But we still don't know the potential. We need to piece it all together. And UK farmers, a third of them are over 65. So it would need a big investment in skills and training, and also infrastructure. So I think in developing this plan, all those things, a potential plan for more UK, but there has to be a proper strategy developed, and it has to be based on evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I move over now to Craig Williams?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm conscious that through Mr. Garnier's question, we touched a lot on the WTO and what the effectiveness of the WTO in this current crisis. But I wondered whether you could help the committee as we look to future UK trade deals around the world, both in the WTO guise and bilaterals. What lessons do you think we could learn, and what should we be expected in those future trade deals to take in light of what's happened in this pandemic? Professor Smith?
So I think the most important thing would be to chart where our food is coming from, and then to, as Bob said, do a piece of work that maps on the export restrictions to those supply routes. So being very clear about how food is coming into the UK. Certainly we've been the DEFRA do have the agriculture in the UK annual report, but I think that would be useful to map that with the export restrictions, and also to look at import restrictions as well in those major suppliers. So in other words, really being clear about the level of protection, both in terms of exports and also in terms of imports in relation to the countries that we negotiate our trade deals with going forward. We also need to be aware, just going back again, the lesson to learn is in terms of the fragility of some of these trade agreements. They do get renegotiated when there has been a change in regime, and those renegotiations can take account of domestic concerns within the state. So you're not always negotiating in an optimal way, in terms of you're not just negotiating on the products that you want to trade, you're also negotiating with the politics in the countries where you're undertaking where you want to negotiate a trade agreement. But there are many brilliant people in Department of International Trade who already know this. So those are the major lessons going forward, and the importance of coalitions. And I can already see that the UK is aligning itself with other major economies, both in the WTO and strategically with its negotiations with the EU at the current time, so major trading partner, the trade negotiations with the US, and also the proposed membership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are all major positive moves for the UK in terms of trade possibilities, with the usual caveats about the tricky issues of quality and environmental protection that goes with all those trade agreements.
Thank you. And we've been frantically negotiating time because we've got the very important Martin Vickers to get in. So Martin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Perhaps just to conclude, I could invite a brief comment from both the witnesses about the long-term impact of the international trade in agri-food, not just of the present pandemic, but the inevitable economic downturn that will follow.
Very good question.
And I'm going to hand that to Bob first while I have a think about that one. Thank you.
Professor Doherty, and if you can keep it brief and concise, please.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the recovery is really, really important. It has to be a sustainable recovery. It has to be a collaborative recovery. We're working with international partners. Also, the sharing of good practice. What the pandemic so far has demonstrated is a lot of good practice in the agri-food sector. People working together, changing agreements, changing the way that supply chains, the terms of those supply chains to help producers. More sharing of information. I think that's really, really important. Also, a focus on vulnerable groups. Going forward, I think we need to do better. At the moment in the UK, we seem to have a two-tier food system, and we need to change that. And also a focus on data. So a focus on data of monitoring and evaluating that real-time data in terms of price fluctuations, sharing that data with suppliers, both corporates and small medium-sized enterprises. One of the things that your next panel might pick up on is that the UK food system is very much dominated by small, medium-sized enterprises. Nearly 90% of the organisations are actually SMEs, and they need a lot of support, a lot of information on a regular basis. A lot of webinars. There's been some really, really good webinars by retailers with suppliers, and I think that good practice needs to continue.
Thank you. And as they say on Newsnight, you've got 20 seconds.
Okay. Very quickly then. I think we need to keep an eye on how countries respond. So our country is going to respond by cranking up their domestic production, or are they going to respond by trading more? And I think there's certainly some evidence that some countries like the US are increasing giving subsidies to their farmers and cranking up domestic production. So I think that's a trend that needs to be watched by the committee and also the Department of International Trade.
Thank you, concisely done. And I appreciate that greatly. And I think there were some interesting nuggets that came out there, and just worth, I think, reiterating. The tea not harvested was something we didn't expect. Pigs going to landfill in America due to COVID affecting slaughterhouses. Food banks being affected by things not coming on the shelves, a panic buying because then there's not stuff to put in. The volunteers themselves being affected by COVID. The Kazakhstan grain restrictions was something I didn't realise or know about. Floods affecting potatoes domestic production in the UK, and the flour content in the grain, something I didn't, or the wetness in the grain affecting the flour content. Yeah, and I think the another thing I didn't fully realise was the WTO allowing temporary export bans on critical food supplies, and that was something that happened in Ireland in the 17th century. Prevented a famine before they lost the Parliament in 1801, and the lack of that restriction, of course, as many know, resulted in the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s and that tragic situation because they couldn't put on that restriction. So there's a number of dimensions in trade that we, with an amateur historian's hat, that we can see as well. I'm now going to switch to the second panel as quickly as I can and ask the second panel to introduce themselves. We've got Andrew Opie, or Opie, because I've got two different spellings here, and to clarify that, please, and Ian Wright. Andrew first.
Yes, it is OP. Thanks, Chair, and hello, everybody. So I'm the Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium. We are the trade association that represents all the major retailers, with the exception of Tesco, plus many of the major food-to-go brands that you see on your high streets.
Thank you very much, and certainly very familiar face to me and probably to this committee, maybe not the current members, but Ian, quick introduction.
Thanks very much. I'm Ian Wright. I'm the Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation, which represents food manufacturers, producers and importers across the UK. And I'm also the co-chair of the Food and Drink Sector Council.
Okay, so we fully all know the situation. I'm looking at Steve back in the Wilson room, and we've got, I think, 53 minutes for this panel, and then that's as far as we could negotiate, and then the guillotine is falling on us. So briefly, can you outline the ways in which your members have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic? Ian or Andrew, to kick off.
Well, I don't mind starting. I mean, it's been a huge challenge, unprecedented challenge. There's no doubt about that. I slightly disagree with some of the previous speakers. I actually think it's shown the supply chain to be robust, actually, and that's been driven by the fact that everybody in the country has got the food that they need, even in these unprecedented times, has shown the flexibility of the supply chain, and also shown the hard work of both retail and workers and their suppliers to get the food on the shelves. So I think it's been a fantastic effort, and has actually highlighted the robustness of the supply chain, particularly if you think of a couple of things. First of all, retailers were really dealing with demand figures which exceeded Christmas, but for a much longer period in Christmas. And generally, members might not be aware, but retailers actually gear up for Christmas quite early. They start 4 or 5 months before, they employ more people, they have more people in their warehouses, they stockpile food, and that means that we all get the food that we need at Christmas. So if you think of those similar levels of demand over a longer period, at a time when we are importing, probably our peak period for imports as well, particularly fresh produce, the fact that everybody in the UK got the food that they needed, I think is testament to the robustness of the supply chain and the hard work of our suppliers and retail workers.
Everything's hunky-dory, Ian Wright.
Oh, well, I'm not sure I'd go.
Your mouth, Andrew. I don't mean to do that badly, but I'm just provocative to you, Ian Wright. Go on.
As ever. I'm not sure I go. I'm not sure what the legal definition of hunky-dory is anyway. But and there's probably a different one in the Western Isles. I think the key point, Andrew's made a couple of important points there. The really amazing thing is that for the last 6-8 weeks, the food delivery system to shoppers has stood up to almost all the tests that have been put to it. Now, that in those first few weeks, not just after the lockdown, but before the lockdown, when people had decided, when the population of Britain, which had the option, had decided to work from home, and we should remember that that was before the lockdown in many cases. Basically what happened was that 30% of the production of food in this country, or the consumption of food in this country, which used to be consumed by out-of-home catering, contract catering, hospitality, call it what you will, walked across the road to retail. And retail was asked to, the rich shops were asked, Andrew's members and the convenience stores were asked to provide the entire food consumption of the UK. Now, of course, there were disruptions to that, not least because the just-in-time system with which we're all so used actually works on the basis of algorithms that are based on previous behaviour. So if the previous behaviour is no guide, the system is blown. So the fact that it came on board very quickly was impressive. Two other things I would point to. One is the fact that international trade in food, or at least imports in food into this country, and as Andrew mentioned, we import 40% of our food overall, have stood up extraordinarily well, including from those from Spain, Italy, and France. And that's a remarkable testament both to the people there and to those who bring the food into this country. And finally, I think there is a really important point that the 500,000 people who work in food and drink across this country in manufacturing, the hidden heroes of the story, have kept working in circumstances of considerable anxiety and in the middle of a national crisis, and they've kept producing. And to do so at the levels they have is a real success. Now, Chair, there have been some other concerns, and I'm sure we're going to come on to those. But I don't want to make it sound as though we're in Elysian fields. We're not. This is a national crisis, and it's really difficult. But there have been some successes, and we should applaud those as well as be realistic about what else has happened.
I mean, what have been the key challenges that the sector has faced in responding to the pandemic impacts? What were the top three surprising things? I know what you're saying about the algorithms there, but what really came out as a bit of a surprise and a shock that maybe is learning for the future?
Well, shall I go first on that?
Yeah,
go on, Angie.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would say that the fact that the good surprise has been that the system stood up, but that I think we have to accept that none of us would probably have thought that, and it's kind of blindingly obvious now, but it wasn't then, that the way in which the algorithms and the systems which manage supply were all based on previous behaviour. And of course, if previous behaviour is capable of being so changed overnight, then of course things will change. But I don't think, of course, people have preparations for pandemics, but maybe this is a lesson for that kind of think the unthinkable. The second big thought I have is that until about the beginning of March, nobody would have actually realised that out-of-home and hospitality was essentially a discretionary purchase. We would have assumed that we would always go to coffee shops, we would always go to restaurants, we'd always go down the pub. And the fact that it could be turned off and retail would have to be left on may have been obvious to some, but it certainly wasn't obvious to me or to a whole lot of the industry. And I think that's the second thing. And the third thing, which is probably less well observed, is that at least in the initial part of the crisis, we failed a bit to properly serve convenience stores and local stores and focused on supermarkets. And I think that is a learning lesson rather that we should have, because convenience stores and local stores represent 25% of consumption in this country. Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure it is 25% actually. I think the top 10 grocers account for about 90% of sales, but I'm not going to quibble over that. I agree with much of what Ian has said there. I think a couple of things that I wanted to point out. I think Ian's point around where we thought there might be the challenges not coming was a little bit of a surprise to us. So the fact that pasta exports actually increased from Italy during a period when they were facing severe problems with the virus was probably a surprise. Similarly, that Spanish fruit production continued where workers obviously were affected, again, a surprise. I think the biggest challenge, though, for us was the speed at which things changed and their influence on consumers, particularly, for example, key announcements such as school closures and when we went into the lockdown. That had a real immediate impact on consumers, which no supermarket really could stockpile enough in advance for. And the notice period was so short that we weren't told. And similarly, I mean, again, where we really rose to the challenge in the retail sector, but was an enormous challenge, was on the evening when the government announced that we were going into lockdown and social distancing was going to be required for those who shop in supermarkets. I mean, we convened a very quick conference call with our members that evening, quite late at night, to agree things that supermarkets would put in place quickly, such as the plexiglass screens you see, the 2-meter distancing, the management of queues to get that going. But again, the notice was actually so short for that. It was a fantastic reaction from retailers to be able to do it. And actually many of the lessons are now going to be used, hopefully, for the non-food shops, which hopefully will be opening sometime in the future. But I think it was trying to manage through these and react to these very quick changes was very, very difficult. The final thing I would say, though, where we did have some advantages is we actually knew some of those challenges were coming because some of our members operate stores in Europe where they had already seen the virus happening. So from Ireland, for example, we knew as soon as the government there announced school closures, the supermarkets faced intense panic buying at that time. So we knew in this country, as soon as the government announced school closures, we would see the same in the UK, and we did see the same in the UK.
Fascinating. Just for members here, there's been, you might have heard a bell there, it's the virtual division, which we've got 15 minutes to vote, but I think we can vote and continue with what we are doing, hopefully, because we are that type of person, I think, that we can manage to multitask. He said, looking for these bits of paper rapidly. Can I bring in Matt Western at this point?
Thank you, Chair, and we'll try and do two things at the same time. Okay. Just following up on that point, I really put it to both of you, but just pick up the points that I think that Andrew Opie was making, and about the learnings really from other markets. And of course, we do have not just very successful domestic food retailers, but also some very successful ones from Europe. And of course, they would be several weeks ahead of us in terms of their experience of COVID-19 and the crisis and how that was impacting really on the supply. So I guess the question to me, having seen firsthand and also the reports of just the reaction to the crisis, was knowing that we were several weeks behind what was going on in Europe, elsewhere in Europe, how well you think the sector was prepared really for the outbreak, and how successful the chains, the industry was in strengthening its resilience to international supply chains?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I think they did give us some advantages. So most of the major retailers that we were dealing with set up their emergency incident groups in early February. So looking ahead to see or trying to learn from countries like Italy, Austria that had seen the virus first. The problem is, as I alluded to at the start, when we prepare for Christmas, we start in about July, August, and build up slowly in that period. So while supermarkets rapidly took on thousands of workers, particularly in the warehouse and distribution area, because actually this was a problem about logistics. It wasn't a supply issue. There was plenty of food, and we always knew there was food out there. It was just getting it to the shops and onto the shelves quickly enough. So they did try to react to that as quickly as possible. They tried to increase their online delivery, and we've seen that happen. The problem was it was a relatively short period of time. Where it did help was to signal where these kind of pinch points were likely to be. But also, interestingly, those companies that you alluded to, they were able also to say, for example, in Austria and countries like that, who had maybe gone through the peak of their problems, had the lockdown in the supermarkets, that actually the supermarkets themselves recovered relatively quickly. So we were always confident as an organization, saying that we knew that the country would get the food it needed and things would return to normal as possible within social distancing after a period, because the consumers in places like Austria really aren't that different to consumers here. And to get the feedback from those companies directly from their experience in those countries was really useful to reinforce our message, what we could tell government, but also what we were telling the media at the time as well, which is why we always use that language. We were always confident the country would get the food that it needed. Might not always be the food that we choose on a regular basis, but you'd get the food that you needed. So it was great to get that intelligence. It did help the preparations, but you're still probably looking at a 4 or 5 week preparation, where for Christmas, we probably would take 4 to 5 months.
Okay.
Yeah. I just have a go at that?
Yes.
I mean, same sort of point. We have a number of a whole range of manufacturers who operate both in Asia and in Europe. And in our case, I think it was more about some of the technical things of setting up the factories and the production lines. So I think we knew that we would need to do some form of distancing. I think we knew that we would need to look at range rationalization. We were asked to do that by retailers. So I can think of one company which would normally at that time of year, be producing over 80 different stock keeping units, SKUs, individual products, and they went down to 12 in order to deal with the possibility of any kind of absence. And I think also some of the issues around transport to work, schools, reconfiguring catering, all those practical, pragmatic issues were things that we knew of reasonably well in advance.
Okay, thank you for that. Just a question to you specifically, Mr. Opie. What do you think has been the effect of the pandemic on sourcing operations of food retailers in respect of overseas supply, and particularly not just thinking about sort of obvious products, but constituent products as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely given some headaches. If nothing else, the technologists who generally work for the supermarkets and fly out to countries and look at the quality and the production of those plants haven't been able to do that, obviously, and nor is auditing going on in those areas. So there's definitely some technical issues. But actually, the sourcing itself held up relatively well. We import about 80% of our goods, food from the EU for supermarkets. So only the remaining 20% comes from the rest of the world, and they're within that probably less than 10% from developing countries. So it's relatively small in terms of the food that you would see in a supermarket, particularly as we're probably around 70 to 75% UK sourcing here. So it's not a major issue for us. The major challenge was really Spain and Italy. Those were the two key countries for exports into the UK and two key countries that were affected by the virus. So provided those countries stood up well, which they did, and we were getting daily updates from those countries, from the suppliers there, we knew actually that we were reasonably comfortable in terms of food on the shelves.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just turn to you, Mr. Wright, in terms of exports and just how well domestic producers have been doing through this period in terms of exports? Are we seeing marked increases, flat, or decreases?
I think it's a very patchy picture. We asked our members this week what their experience was, and about half had seen no change. Only about 8% had seen increases, and over a third had seen nearly 40% had seen either a decrease or the exports stop. And I think it's pretty much directed towards where the customer is. If the customer is in retail, then the exports have continued. If the customer is in hospitality, then the exports have probably declined sharply or ceased. And a good example of that would be fine cheese. So if you're exporting fine English cheese to Europe, it's usually to a restaurant or an eating establishment, and it's unlikely to be continued because it's not a product even that you can store. So those sorts of issues have happened. There've been some repurposing of exports, and certainly in the last couple of weeks, China and Asia has come back extremely strongly, but it's that sort of picture.
That's interesting. And just really finally, for both of you, what do you see as the long-term changes to the supply chains in the aftermath of this?
Well, let me go first.
Good question.
I think there will be some big changes, but they will be partly driven by what the market looks like over here. So I think the speed with which out of home comes back, and I'm very much of the view that out of home will come back differentially. So if it's food to go, I know that's not the right technical expression, but if it's food to go, then that will come back moderately fast as workplaces open up. If it's sitting down food, eating in pubs or restaurants, then that's going to take longer. And so the trade which supports those two different options will be differentially affected. I think there will be some impacts in terms of, and Andrew would be much better placed to answer this, of shoppers initially at least looking at products from nearer to home. That's a natural reaction in a crisis. But I do think, I know we're going to get onto this whole question of self-sufficiency. I do think that the UK shopper doesn't necessarily always immediately think of the origin of the product. And when they realise, that the product comes at least partially from abroad, and 40% of the food we eat is imported, and most of that is in ingredients rather than in ready food, I think they will start to think about that. And I'm not sure there will be quite the enthusiasm for a protectionist agenda as might have been alluded to in the earlier session. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I mean, my only build on that would be it's probably focused our minds more on the EU-UK trade deal than ever before. And in fact, we're already starting discussions with the government over that, because obviously we had frictionless borders to bring in all of that fresh produce I spoke to earlier. We are approaching a similar cliff edge, potentially in January next year, where the short straits crossing, which I think somebody referenced in the previous session, is so important to shoppers here. Getting fresh produce across within our just-in-time supply chains relies on the ports at Dover, Folkestone, working at 100% rate. And therefore, our real concern now is turning to the EU-UK trade deal, because I think it has shone a light on our reliance on imports, particularly of fresh produce, at this time of the year. So it'll be a similar time of the year from the near continent. That's the bit we really need to resolve.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Mark Hendrick, I think, in a second. But just to let you know, I'm sure I think other people are having the same issue, that our remote vote is still loading on both my phone and my iPad, which I've tried. I'm seeing some nods there, which we won't do too much in that. But we've got tomorrow's trial as well. But I really hope this works, personally speaking. Mark Hendrick.
Thanks, Chair. Can I ask, how has the government, and in particular the Department for International Trade, assisted the agri-food sector in responding to international supply chain issues caused by the pandemic?
Shall I go first? Well, one of the things that it's not just the Department of International Trade. Where I would say there's been very good cooperation has been between DIT and DEFRA. And DEFRA moved pretty quickly on the mechanics of supply. And I think this is a lesson, incidentally, for other departments as business opens up in the weeks to come. So DEFRA very quickly established something called the Food Industry Resilience Forum, and brought together the operations directors of all the leading retailers, all of Andrew's members, plus some others. It brought in the operations directors of the manufacturers, of those who do distribution, of the wholesalers, of the freight companies, and so on. And this group has met every morning up to last week, and now it's 3 times a week, looking at specific issues and specific concerns. They also brought in a guy called Chris Tyas, Tyas, in case you want to write it down, who is the former global supply director of Nestle, immensely distinguished business leader in this very specialist field of logistics. And that group has addressed issues. It hasn't debated, it hasn't discussed, it has simply surfaced issues that are barriers to getting the supermarket shelves full. And that could be, can people in manufacturing go to school? It could be, are the police properly informed about who key workers are? But it equally well could be, can you get through the Port of London, or can you get through London Gateway without paper documentation? Are there enough drivers? All those issues. have been surfaced on that call. And I think that that has been a real aid to the way that this crisis has been dealt with. And the Department for International Trade has been engaged in those calls, although they've been called by DEFRA. And we've had a lot of cooperation with DIT in opening up ports, in getting the green lanes working through Europe. So it's been a collective effort. And on the practical side, it's been very, very collaborative. Andrew.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with that. Our main reference point has been with DEFRA. We've worked very closely with them, and both their officials and the Secretary of State have been superb in giving us the support that we've needed and the links into DIT. Our experience with DIT is therefore fairly limited, but it'd be remiss of me not to mention the help they gave us in securing paracetamol exports out of India, which was a major problem for everybody for a while when India closed its borders. And actually they did secure quite a large consignment of paracetamol just at a time when we were running dangerously short of paracetamol. So when we needed them, spoke to Greg Hands, the minister, and they really did make a difference in that point.
Can you say, in terms of resilience for the future, what do you think that producers and retailers have learned from this, and what can government do to make things better in the future?
I think I'd go back to our resilience really relies on our trading relationship, particularly with our largest trading partner, which is the EU. There is no getting away from that. 80% of our food imports for supermarkets come from the EU. We rely on them heavily to supplement when we are out of season, which is through the sort of the hungry years. So that's the bit for me that we absolutely have to get right going forward. We have to have a good trading relationship with the EU. It's vital to our consumers here. And within that also, for Northern Ireland, we need to also resolve the issue of transport between Great Britain and Northern Ireland whilst preserving the issues that EU has over the single market. So for Northern Ireland consumers, they have the added kind of issue on there about how we transport from our Great Britain depots into Northern Ireland without the checks being so excessive that they make the food almost unaffordable when it reaches the supermarket in Northern Ireland. So for me, it is that EU, sorry to bore everyone, but it is the EU-UK trade deal that is fundamental to our resilience going forward.
I mean, it's particularly bad given it's COVID-19 is going off while we're in this transitional period. The idea that we can finish it on time as well seems to me to be a bit far-fetched. But Ian, what do you make of it?
Well, I can just say we've taken a view that for the last 6 weeks and for a bit more, we're going to just focus on dealing with the virus and dealing with the pandemic, and we're not going to get into too many political arguments about Brexit or indeed about pausing regulation consultations or whatever, because we want to focus on cooperating with government. But I certainly think that the thing that strikes me about the future is none of us know what the economic and, importantly, the social impacts of this virus will be, either on the UK or on anyone else. So trying to decide what you want as a policy outcome when you haven't got a clue what society will look like, will it be 7-8 million people unemployed, as some people are suggesting, 25% cut in GDP over the next few months? And for us as exporters, what sort of markets are we going to be exporting into, both in Europe and elsewhere? So for us, that's a concern that I'm probably way above my pay grade. On the practical issues, I think back to that question of exports, we have really focused on imports and looking after the UK shopper, because that's our primary duty, and indeed the primary duty of government. Primary duty of government, in my view, is to feed the nation. Food's a matter of national security, as we've heard all the way through. And if you don't feed the country, you don't have a country. But going forward, as this crisis eases, if it does, the capacity for the UK to export is going to be very important. And we're going to need the help of DIT, with DEFRA backing it, in a real effort to restore our position on food exports.
Thank you. I see Mark Garney indicating that he would like to come in briefly on this one, and then we'll go to Mick Whitley, poised on Merseyside. Mark, you want in quickly?
Thank you, Chair. My question, I think, is really to Ian Wright. You've given us a very, very, very pleasing example of how the government has worked very well when it comes to these food industry resilience forum meetings. which is fantastic. I suppose following on from your last point about the future, my question is this, is you know, when you look at this, the food industry, it reports to DEFRA, DIT has a role to play, and you talk about exports being important, but you've got BEIS regulation, you've got all sorts of different things that are incredibly important to the food and retail industry. How do you find, sort of going forward, the possibility that the government may learn how to better engage as a single government, rather than you having to deal with a whole host of different departments? Or is that not really a problem? I mean, how do you find in normal periods dealing with the government? Is it too complicated, or can we learn a lot from what's happened over the last few weeks?
I'd say learn a lot from what's happened. And I don't think that necessarily means that you need to have only one department deals with food. That would, of course, be easier in many ways. But when you draw those lines, sometimes you get unexpected widows and orphans left over the border, and you don't know quite how that will ever be dealt with. So I think that the notion of having a lead department with a very clear locus to act is important, and that's what's happened in this case. I think it is important that other departments are brought in, and where I would see the opportunity is to have a clear policy view that includes all aspects of food and drink, which is why I think that the much vaunted Henry Dimbleby review of food and drink strategy is important, but it has to be practical. And, you know, from the perspective of being the chair of the Food and Drink Sector Council, which is the place where industry is supposed to come together to make that policy, I really hope we seize that opportunity going forward. And I suppose I can't help going back to my business career, working mostly for Diageo, the world's biggest drinks business. One of the things we would have done with all our customers is have a single point of contact, a single account person responsible for the whole account. That person would have been responsible for arraying the whole of our activity as a company, which wouldn't just have been sales, it would have been support, it would have been about product development, and that person would have had responsibility for dealing with the customer. I think that sort of model in this case is one that the government has sort of adopted by force majeure, and it would be useful to continue with it.
Can I go over to Mick Whitley now, Mick?
Yeah, good afternoon, Ian. Good afternoon, Andrew. If you just ask us, how severe is the labour supply shortage in the agri industry as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how could it disrupt global food supply chains?
Andrew, do you want to go, or do you want me to?
Ian, you go, and then I might talk about seasonal workers, if you like, after that.
Yeah. Well, Mick, neither of us represent farmers, and as you can imagine, even daring to speak for farmers at a committee like this would probably have us hung up by some unpleasant bit of our body. So we won't do that. But we can say that there is and Andrew's going to speak about seasonal workers, so that's helpful. I think the labour supply over the last few weeks has been pretty extraordinary. And one of the things I said earlier, and I think it's important to note, is that absence rates in both, as I understand it, retail, certainly in distribution and absolutely in manufacturing, they started at about 20%, mostly people who are either self-isolating, looking after relatives, or looking after vulnerable or shielded relatives. They've come right down to about 5, 6, 7, 8%. Now, it's important to say that almost all my members and all of the big companies have very, very unfortunate examples of fatalities amongst their workforce. But those are very small in number and not always to do with contracting the virus at the workplace. So we do, I think, and this is not me declaring victory, it is simply because I don't know the answer to this, but I think it is important that at some point somebody does some work on understanding whether it is the case that the workplaces that we have maintained and this includes Andrew's colleagues as well, over the last 6 weeks have been sufficient. I think it appears that they have been places where workers could go safely. And that has meant we haven't had mass absence, and we therefore haven't had difficulties in production. more globally, I think that is not always the case. And I think that was being talked about in the first session by the two professors. So I think there is a challenge, but Andrew can talk about the specific challenge of seasonal workers.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just before that, just to point out, the fact that the social distancing that our members in put into place in supermarkets are very much done in mind and discussions with colleagues in store who've really been absolute heroes through the whole thing, really reinforced their use in store, and I think reduced absence rates, gave those workers in supermarkets a level of confidence to continue coming into work and serving customers, which is a real testament to that. I think in terms of migrant workers, it is a concern, obviously. We're going into the main seasonal harvest now, season period. We're flipping over from sort of Spain, Portugal, Italy into British produce. Tomatoes will be going basically from 95% imports into the majority being produced here. Soft fruit, again, flipping almost 50% over to the UK. So we need 80,000 workers to replace the migrant workers who normally would come to the country. And therefore, I think that's going to be our real challenge. Now, I know DEFRA has plans in place. It has campaign running at the moment in terms of getting people to come and work on farms and in processing plants. But I think we really need to keep an eye on that as we go into May, June, into this real key season for us of British produce to make sure it continues to come off the farms and onto the supermarket shelves.
Yeah, just a supplementary question, if I may. Which agri-food products are most at risk from labour shortages?
Well, for us, it would obviously be seasonal fruit and vegetables is the obvious one. I mean, interestingly, what I think one of the previous speakers spoke about meat production, for example. That was definitely one of our concerns before the incident really got going, and we've been in touch with FSA throughout the incident. Touch wood to date, we've been okay in terms of both workers and inspectors and vets in those plants, because they could be quite crucial if they had a high absence rate, which they haven't seen to date, so they've managed to keep them going. So obviously that would be an issue, but really for us is seasonal fruit and vegetables now are going to be our major thing that we'll be looking at.
Mick, if I can just add two thoughts. One is that the problems that we are seeing beginning to emerge on dairy products and beef, and probably other meats to follow, are all driven by the hospitality issue, not by labour shortages. It's all about where producers have been targeting particular markets, and those markets have disappeared. The other thing is that certainly I would want, and I think Andrew would want, to give proper credit to our union colleagues who have been extremely effective partners throughout this. And I have to say, in the case of the FDF, we had not given sufficient heed over recent years to our partnership with the union. And the fact that we've been able to work very productively with Unite, GMB, Bakers Union, and USDOR has been a huge help through all of this.
Thank you. Can I move to the august chairman of the EFRA Select Committee, patiently standing by in Tiverton and Honiton and Devon, I think. Neil Parish.
Yeah, thank you, Angus. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you loud and clear. The reception
right,
good. Is great.
Right. Good. Ian, I'll make sure I don't send the farmers around to sort you out, so don't worry. Now, firstly, before I ask my question, is I'm glad that DEFRA has, stepped up to the plate. There is a problem with carcass balance, especially on the beef, because of the restaurant sector. We're not selling as many steaks and joints, and of course, much more mince. So I think there's work to be done there. I think the dairy sector is beginning to balance. One of the questions I wanted to throw at you, probably supplementary to the previous questions, is that we have relaxed competition rules. Now, I'm happy for that at the moment, but I don't want you all to get too cozy in the future. So how do you pull out of, it's right in a crisis to raise competition rules, but in the minute we're going to have to reimpose them. So how do you see that happening?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really good question, and it is time limited. So as you probably know, that statutory instrument can be revoked at some point by the Secretary of State. And we don't have a problem with that because actually we respect competition law. For us, actually, ironically, it wasn't the biggest piece of legislation that made the difference through the real peak of the crisis, the biggest thing that made the difference was changing delivery curfew hours so we could deliver more frequently to stores at different times, and extending drivers' hours, because it was all around distribution. So I absolutely hear you on the competition law, but I'm quite confident that the government will be looking to rescind those powers. And remember, they were very, very sharply drawn up as well. So they were not a carte blanche for us to to breach competition law. They were very specific around things such as discussions around changing the ranges, focusing the products that were most in demand for consumers to increase production at Ian's members' factories, really. So they were for a specific purpose, but I've got no doubt they will be rescinded at some point.
And I think there was some sharing data, wasn't there, also, Andrew, which would have allowed DEFRA to make some key decisions and make some interventions. I think, from our point of view, we would agree completely. But we with you and with Andrew, but we believe very strongly in competition. It's probably more to the interest of manufacturers that competition law returns, and these changes have all got sunset clauses. The one thing I would say, though, and this is perhaps not my normal territory, but I think there is a question to be asked about not just about each regulation that has been paused or relaxed. The question to ask is, when should it be reintroduced? And should it be reintroduced? Now, assuming the latter is yes, when it should be reintroduced isn't going to be a single cut-off. A switch isn't going to be thrown. It's going to need to be done sector by sector, possibly even subsector by subsector, to take account, for example, of the dairy issue or the beef issue. And it's going to need to be done very sensitively in order that we don't, on the way out of this massive crisis, cause more problems than we have experienced on the way in. And I think that's something that is not naturally what would happen, but I think we do need to take account of it.
Right. Well, thank you both for those answers, because I think, Ian, on those regulations, it's probably whether we'll have time to look at, but whether we do need to reintroduce everyone is an interesting point that you make, and something I'll bear in mind. Just to say that the Select Committee, we will look into labour and the availability of labour, especially for the fruit picking and vegetable picking. So I assure you, we've got that one in our sights. I will now, Angus, get to my actual question on the order paper, which was
from the EFRA Select Committee. That was fine.
Yeah, okay, that's all right. Sorry for that. But with labour, it's not a case of only having enough labour in this country to process. Are you confident that you'll be able to import in the future, and that the labour effects across, those that you're importing from, are they going to be affected further by COVID-19, or is there going to be an effect long term on the amount of labour they've got to export to us?
Well, I think that was the point that I was raising earlier, really, that the one thing that we were pleasantly surprised about was the lack of impact on production in places like Spain in particular, and Portugal, Morocco, countries that we do import a lot of fruit and vegetables through the winter period. They weren't actually affected by that. So that was actually really positive to us. We've got no reason to believe that that's going to change in the future.
Andrew,
thank you.
Can I ask, is that because where the produce was coming from in Spain was in more rural area and less affected by COVID? Because COVID seems to have been hit capital cities and commercial centres harder than perhaps agricultural areas. I'm sort of shooting in the dark here, but
good point, Angus.
Okay, we're not certain. It's something we can look into, or somebody watching might have a better answer to that than we collectively do. Thank you. I'll move on to Mark Menzies in Fylde in Lancashire there, waiting patiently.
Yeah, hi, Angus. Just a quick one. It's really for Ian Wright. What impact, if any, have international border closures had on UK imports and exports of agri-food products? And I'm particularly interested in the exports as well. Thinking of some of the great products of export, whiskey, for example, or sort of salmon, and so on. I mean, what is those issues that you're starting to detect?
I think it's less border closures so far than the actual shutdown of the markets that they're serving. So, and that's largely to do with hospitality shutting in, first of all, in China, and then the wave coming effectively west. So I don't think actual border closures have necessarily been the problem. It's the market closure that's really got us. And I mean, I've been, as I think we all said, we've been very pleasantly surprised by the fact that product has moved freely in and out of a whole range of different countries. One kind of constraint on that has been that because food and drink has been by and large the only big industry open fully anywhere in Europe and in wider parts of the world, lorries taking product or bringing product do not have their return or out journey full. So normally the transport would have one completely different category in the back of it and then bring food back. When that doesn't happen, the costs the economics of the business go west, and it's really difficult for transport to continue. And I think that's a long-term impact. And I think we'll see when this crisis comes back, there are quite a lot of transport operators who've gone under as a consequence of all of this. I'm sorry to parachute on your answer, but the one other thing just now was that one issue that Professor Doherty, I think, raised in the first session is important, is the question of what happens to workforces in the emerging world, the developing world. And there is a bit of a question about, we don't yet know the impact of this virus on those countries like South Africa or Nigeria or Kenya, or to a degree India. And I think we should just reserve judgment on the impact on those labour forces until we see the long-term results.
Okay, that's really useful. Thanks ever so much. Thank you.
Okay, can we move on to Martin Vickers? Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you, Angus. We've already touched on the trade routes and supply chain and so on, and reference has already been made to congestion at Felixstowe and Dover. But could I ask both witnesses to sort of bring together their thoughts on how effective the primary trade food routes have operated during the crisis, and with the congestion, as has been mentioned, at Felixstowe and Dover? And could I, as an add-on from my constituency, since I represent Immingham on the East Coast, say, Immingham is open for more business?
Shameless. But
Ian,
well done.
I'm going to start because you're likely to import more. Your members are probably importing more through Immingham than we would be. But
yeah, well, of course, I have failed to come properly briefed to big up Immingham through this answer, and I apologise to Martin. I mean, I think the ports our UK ports have worked extremely well. I think the one area that has been a bit clunky is the move from paper documentation to digital documentation. And if somebody earlier asked about the lessons of the crisis, one of the big lessons of this crisis seems to me to go back to really, and there's a bit of an irony with your voting snafu just now. We've got to move to a digital. We've got to be much more conscious of the competence of this digital platform, that it gives us so many options. And it also, in a world where for a long time, I think, people will be more reluctant to travel until they're convinced that they're safe, the digital option is a fantastic safety valve. And so when we're talking about ports, when we're talking about documentation, I think that's important. But I do think, and I also think the processes need to be driven around the digital concept rather than the digital stuff being lumped on top and let's see if it'll work. And I do think that actually happened quite quickly. I would like us to go further as we go forward. But I also think we should reflect that all those people who are working in the ports, incidentally, are also in the front line because they have to go to work. If the vets aren't in the ports or the people handling the containers aren't in the ports, we can't move our products. So we, just as much as our workers are hidden heroes, so are they. Andrew.
Yeah, so just a couple of points really to add. I agree with Ian that the ports have actually worked really well through COVID-19, and particularly across the short straits. I should say we should give some credit to the government in terms of the support it offered for ferry companies at the right time, both on the Dover-Calais route, but actually particularly in our case between GB and Northern Ireland. We ship a lot of product from GB to Northern Ireland stores, and the problems with the ferries there were causing us concern at the time, and the government reacted and stepped in and gave it support, so that was great. I think the final thing to point, and I think somebody's already talked about the kind of what the exit strategy is from this. One of the issues which I have seen raised is, as we do exit COVID and maybe we want to protect our borders, just to make sure that it doesn't impact too much on imports. So checks on drivers, for example, potential quarantine on either planes or people coming in as well is something that we do need to bear in mind, that it could have an impact on our imports as well. But other than that, I would say, yeah, the ports have operated really well.
Thank you. And I'm turning now to Robert Kurtz, who I can see is standing by and his mic's ready, which is good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask Ian, please, about how the increasing freight costs, but the reduced capacity has affected importers and exporters of agri-food in the UK, please.
Well, that is it's going to be a big issue, that, going forward. I mean, it's been balanced by the collapse in the oil price, of course. So you've had to, and people have asked, actually, if I may take the opportunity, more generally on pricing, why is it as it is? Well, it's all over the place because there are all sorts of different inputs going in different directions. And so freight costs have gone up, and that is a concern. So too is freight availability, because if the driver can't afford to go, they sometimes don't. But drivers themselves have been incredibly willing to work. So absence rates amongst drivers in sort of 3, 4, 5%, extraordinary. But the costs are a problem, and the problem will go on for quite a long time, because until the rest of industry is in full production, those lorries will still be going around literally half full. And I think that's a big concern. But it's difficult to aggregate or disaggregate because of the oil price collapse that's gone on at the same time.
Thank you. Is there anything that the Department of International Trade can do to help importers and exporters secure access to affordable transport?
That's a good question. Andrew, do you have any views on that? I'm not sure I'm competent to answer that.
No, I don't.
I mean, I think I guess
such a good question, there's no answer.
Well, we don't tend to have the export issue that Ian has.
Yeah. Which is his clever way of saying that I should know the answer. But if I may, let me take that under advisement, and I will write to you and to our distinguished chair to give you an answer on that, because it is a really good question, and I should know the answer, and I don't.
Thank you. We'd all be very keen to hear the answer to that if you could offer us any suggestions. Thank you.
Sure.
Well done, and thanks for the most probing question of the day goes to the Honourable Member for Whitney. Well done. I think we're coming to the end. We're coming to the end quite nicely with about 3 minutes to go, and I appreciate the witnesses hanging on a little longer. I hope you didn't have other commitments. I'm thankful that you've done that. There's one small question I've got to ask, because there are sort of borders have been closed in here that I know coming into the Scottish Islands, we've had sort of a border in effect between France and Germany. There's been a border, between Denmark and Germany, and we have a border. These other borders that have been sort of closing between the European states and within sort of like Scotland or wherever, have been really there to impede the movement of people who might be carrying the virus, obviously. Have these border things, also between Northern Ireland and the Republic, have these border measures had any impact on the movement of your goods?
No, not really. I mean, we did see, so you're probably aware the French introduced a new sort of testament about 3 or 4 weeks ago that lorry drivers had to carry with them and were checked. There's been temperature checks that have been applied to drivers at borders, including Germany, for example. We found they've added hours rather than had such a significant kind of difference that it would maybe push back to a day. And I know one of the previous speakers spoke about the kind of the just in time and the fact that fresh produce generally needs to move. So we have noticed it, but not to an extent that's actually having an impact on goods on the shelves.
I'd agree with that, Angus, and I think that again this has been testament actually to not just to the resilience of the system, but also to the redoubtable nature of some of the drivers who've stuck with it when it's been, they've had long waits at different border posts. can I just, I missed one answer to Mark Garnier's question.
Yeah, you've got 30 seconds.
Yeah, single point of contact, I said. The one issue that's fallen between between the different hosts has been the issue of those who don't have access to food, the 2 million people who who get their food through food banks and Fair Share and organisations like that. We don't have a minister for hunger, and actually, I think that is something we should think about, because it's no single department's responsibility, and we've all been trying to deal with it, and none of us succeeded properly.
That is an absolutely cracking point, I think, on which to end this afternoon's session. And I think we learned an awful lot there. We learned from Ireland when the schools closed, when we learned that Austrian consumers were much like UK consumers. There's a warning here for a January cliff edge. There's the point here of when regulations might be relaxed, and they shouldn't all be switched together, but they should be thought through and what shocks they might cause. And the final point there, a brilliant point, as I would expect from my old friend Mr. Wright there, as a Minister for Hunger. And if that alone comes from today's session, that would be, I think, personally, worthwhile. Colleagues and witnesses, can I thank you all for your patience, kindness, and consideration of me and each other again today. You've made this work, I think, very well. And on that happy note, I wish you all good afternoon. Have a great week end when it comes. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding